I'll make this an abbreviated version. My title of my talk is Which Mobile Apps Are Good for Sustainable Development? It's based on my applied research. I'm a professor at SUNY University in SUNY Korea, and I taught a class on the undergraduate level on mobile revolution and development that I designed there about 5 times. I also teach mobile technologies and disaster risk reduction as well. So I'm very interested and personally aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals, and my goals, I hope, are your goals of how we implement these in a much better way. And I have a suggestion of how you can do it much cheaper, faster, and more efficiently. 2 points of my talk can be summarized right now, and then I'll elaborate those. First, add 3 rubrics to the SDGs to be more effective. And second, I'll show you 3 solutions about that. 3 levels of abstract sustainable development goals lack that would create a better encouragement for them. As Sustainable Development Goals were rolled out from Millennium Development Goals into the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, it was probably politically wise not to connect them to particular implementation. It was left to particular nations to define how they were going to monitor as well as organize and achieve those particular goals. And I would suggest this should not preclude the United Nations to develop some kind of informal recommended implementation that could be added to that. And I'm going to have 3 suggestions of rubrics that I think would make it far easier to actually implement and compare and learn from the Sustainable Development Goals that are being attempted in one country to another country. Right now, it's sort of apples and oranges. As one attempts to implement it, you're not sure if your measurements of another country are going to be applicable to learn from. But one is disaggregated geography. Instead of just an abstract goal about abstract planetary sustainability, or instead of just a form of national sustainability, you need a more clear rubric of what geographies you're dealing with. And I'm going to suggest watersheds or ecoregions, and I'll explain that momentarily. I also suggest we need more disaggregated views about what sustainability is. Material clarity on the actual 130 plus material categories of material sustainability per category. And once you have a list of those particular kinds of material uses, then 3 questions can be asked about how you integrate those in terms of waste flows, as well as particularly better choices in particular regions for particular categories. And how do you get to more disaggregated people and awareness of more cost effectiveness of reaching billions of people with mobile phone technologies. It's not widely known, but by January 2019 of this year, according to some statistics I've seen, there are over 5 billion mobile phones this year, 2.5 billion smartphones, and the numbers are only increasing. So my 3 mobile apps ideas achieve this. A prototype for one is being developed now at our university. I'm sort of the client. It's a collaborative arrangement between the computer science department and my own department. And anyway, 2 sections of my review. I will skip my educational background to be brief, but mostly environment, technology, and society relationships are my interest. And I have degrees from University of Wisconsin-Madison in sociology, but my interests are in more human-environmental interactions, and some awards from U.S. National Science Foundation for my dissertation research, and the Korean National Science Foundation after I went to be resident in Korea. Theoretical and empirical point, there are now global network effects from mobile phones in rich and poor countries alike. A lot of people talk about a digital divide, and that's very true when you go to things like internet or other kind of services. But I would even say we have a digital parity developing, even a digital surplus, and I'll describe what I mean by those 2 terms in a moment. This means more efficiency is achieved if you create common solutions via mobile platforms encouraging economic, social, and sustainable development. From that, the applied knowledge point, there's a network effect from all these billions of phones that can be used to piggyback services for popularizing the SDGs. And 3 ideas of this. One is called commodity ecology, which is a database application. Already, thanks to Mr. Ramadardharan, this was featured on the UNA website for the Sustainable Development Goals under Sustainable Development Goal number 12, encourage sustainable production and consumption relationships. But this was an idea of a modular, multi-regional, worldwide sustainable development based on watersheds, particular geographic rubric, and based on particular disaggregated materials in particular categories. The prototype is what's now in process. Commodity ecology, the game. This is ideas for gamification applied to commodity ecology. It's a youth education via a game platform version of this. So the first one is for adults, basically, or young adults, and then youth. So they can both become more conscientization, to use Paulo Freire's term, conscientization regarding the Sustainable Development Goals. And 3 of 3 civic democratic institutions, the idea for recognizing more non-governmental, less politically partisan heroes. It's not what you promise to get when you run for political office, but people would recognize particular people in particular regions, and those would naturally be the ones that you might work with for civic partnerships or forms of producer and consumer relationships on the local level. But anyway, just to make a quick summary of the theoretical point, 3 M names, Moore, Metcalf, and McGuire, but you've probably heard of Moore's Law. Since the early 1970s, with the miniaturization of technology, Gordon Moore, who worked for Intel, came up with the idea of Moore's Law, which was every 2 years it was expected, even in the 70s, that a certain area on a chip, you could fit double the number of transistors within 2 years. And that's surprisingly been true for almost 40 years. It's only slightly dropped off to about 1.5. He's updated that. But you probably haven't heard of the second person, Metcalf, network value. The best way to describe this is a fax machine. One fax machine is not very useful. 100,000 fax machines are very useful. So when you buy a product, you're really not buying the utility of that fax machine. You need the network to make it useful. And now McGuire sort of updated Metcalf by the value of more mobile products and services. Think about now you can use your smartphone to actually make facsimile or fax. You can simply photograph it and carry the fax around with you. So that kind of fax machine in your pocket is much more efficient than the tabletop version of the past. So this can be applied to rolling out sustainable development goals. And the smaller chips were the ones that were allowing the mobility and cheapness, and the cheapness allowed for everybody to buy one. That makes a network value, and as it gets smaller, it becomes a mobile network value. And applied to sustainable development goals, development is more efficiently implemented when it has network value and when taking advantage of a mobile network service. I'll skip that in the interest of time. But just a summary, first United States data and then international data. For the United States, smartphones have been the fastest adopted technology in US history. If you notice the telephone, this is 2015 data. It took us 66 years to get only about 35% of the United States with a telephone. But once those networks were available, it's much faster to build the internet off of that, and then smartphones themselves built off of that, maybe about 7 or 8 years to reach 70%. Right now it's over 90% smartphones in the United States. What about globally? Maybe it's just a developed effect, right? Is there a digital inequality here? This is from the same year of 2015. This is World Bank data. It says mobile cellular subscriptions per 100 people at the top. The world is about 100 here, dealing with the black line in the middle. And above that are the usual suspects. You have the OECD, Germany, United States, Australia. But surprisingly, who else is above the world average? Places you wouldn't expect, like the failed state of the Russian Federation now after the decline of the Soviet Union, then small city-state of Qatar, Thailand. You have Central Asia there, Colombia, Latin America, Arab world, Pacific and Asia. Those are areas actually with greater network densities of mobile phones than the world average. And this sort of reverses the idea that mobile technologies are just a developed world diffusion. They're actually far denser in a lot of developing countries now and are very useful for rolling out forms of development. Anyway, some more statistics to give us updated to the present from 2017-18 to 2019. If the world population in 2017 was about 4.5 billion, we notice the green box here says unique mobile users. 66% of the world in 2017 actually had a mobile phone. The internet penetration was just 50. So my point is, from between 50 and 66, you notice that the greater parity here, the greater equipment use is going to be mobile phones. And this continued into January of 2019 with slightly 1% higher, but also at 67% versus 57%. Mobile phones are actually the more hegemonic tool, and therefore you're reaching people with lesser transaction costs another way. And it's also a greater parity, greater to reach more developing countries if you have mobile development apps. What about Africa? You think, well, it could possibly be in Africa. But actually, from January 2018, if you look at the green box again, 82% of Africa had a mobile phone. This is not smartphones. But that's over 1 billion people in Africa. This has outleaped electricity. There's still many countries that don't even have 50% or even 25% electrical grids. But nonetheless, mobile phones are leading that, and they're causing the desire for building these more decentralized structures. So mobile phones in Africa are leading that. What about 1 year later? It's dropped down from 82 to 80. but nonetheless, I think that's because the population has slightly grown. But nonetheless, 80% mobile subscriptions versus just 36% internet prescriptions. You see what I mean, that this is a dominant technology worldwide. What about India? India is about comparable right now to the population of all of Africa. It's 1.36 billion, and India is at 87% mobile subscriptions, as you were mentioning the detailed strength of that there. And this is 87% versus just 41% for internet users. Now let's summarize the 3 app solutions that I have. This commodity ecology, which I passed around to you, it's very difficult to see on the screen, so I gave you a printed copy. It's something I've been working on for about 20 years to find a disaggregated form of materials. So the idea of this chart is to disaggregate material sustainability, but also to disaggregate the world, and disaggregated geography is very important. The point is the prototype of this mobile app provides a database platform for this. The rubrics comprise a set of 130 different material categories and a model of how they interact in particular regions. It allows us to consider 3 questions, aided by a real or virtual community conference, and ideally by the durable connections of a shared mobile phone application by either practitioners, citizens, consumers, and producers to talk to each other regularly, even outside of their normal physical existence. The 3 questions are, once you have those rubrics in hand, do we have enough plural sustainable choices available in a particular category yet? That can be debated once you have a common rubric around the world in this particular region. 2, are we choosing well in this category towards sustainability yet in this particular region? 3, how can we help local consumers, producers, and the environment at the same time by linking categories and understanding what products or wastes in one commodity category is more productively used in other categories. So it's a way of regionally linking useful wastes that could go into another category. I'm not the first person to say this, but waste, is simply money that's wasted that should be used somewhere else. Somebody else can find the use for that. The point is, it's less abstract and interpretive than the SDGs. You either have these sustainable options in these categories or you lack them. There's nothing interpretive about that. You either have waste streams that you understand for particular industries, or you lack ideas for how to deal with that. It's very simple. It's a rubric. It's an ongoing checklist for sustainability, unlike the goals for the SDGs, which I wholeheartedly support, and that's the interest in developing sort of a way to implement these in a more economical way. Plus, my argument is you will achieve many other SDG goals simply through building this commodity ecology. Because so much of these other rubrics of social life, towards a more sustainable regional material development, once you develop something with less externalities and more choices in particular regions, it's going to allow other SDGs to be developed more regularly. Thus, SDGs are achieved as secondary multiplier effects of building this more representative ecology. This slide simply summarizes both the other 2 ideas. There are no prototypes yet, but those are in plan. The second app is for a networked mobile development. It's a gamification of commodity ecology for youth. Ideas for this are still open, and I'm here basically to get ideas for how you might help me implement this or align with particular things that you're already doing on these kinds of outreaches. 5 ideas for how you might game this or make points are listed here that I will talk about later if you would like me to come back to this slide. The third mobile application, called a civic democratic institution, is a means of recognizing who are the already supported regional leaders and heroes in whatever capacities they are. This non-governmental recognition of civil leaders and its special voting means of recognition creates a good venue of collaborative moderates instead of polarized factions. It was first mentioned in my first book, Toward a Bi-Regional State, in 2005. And now we live in a mobile network world. So I wrote that book before mobile technology networks really had existed around smartphones. And now I think it's best to popularize versions of this and update my model with mobile phone technologies in mind. And what are the other, I've talked about disaggregated phones, I've talked about disaggregated access to people, talked about disaggregated materials, and now let's talk about disaggregated geographies. Well, one way of doing this is watersheds. And of course, watersheds are just an abstract idea that you can map literally the entire world based on where water falls and flows to a point. And that many states have taken that idea and they map their territories for watersheds. But if you notice, there's something very strange about this US map. There's actually 20 regions that are Uber regions for watersheds. Those are called HUCs, hydrologic unit codes. And it gets fine-grained and nested as it goes down. But if you notice between the US and Canada, there's really no straight line there. So my point is, if you adopt watersheds or ecoregions as implementation procedures for the Sustainable Development Goals, you naturally are going to develop frameworks of cross-border cooperation. This is what the European Union is using right now to facilitate forms of cross-border collaboration within the European Union. But this is from Grasshopper Geography. It's the first person who's ever bothered to do a global map of world watersheds. If you look at the space between the United States and Canada, that straight line doesn't exist. So it's naturally encourage people to manage border regions. And if you know anything about border regions, they tend to be more marginalized communities, and they tend to experience greater environmental problems on both sides of the border. So this would naturally encourage the worst areas, the most neglected areas, to be more regularly integrated within a developmental paradigm. This is a map of ecoregions, which is actually also a screen of one of the prototypes of the app right now. It will recognize your browser or your phone where you are in GPS and encourage you to post or to view all the good ideas that come from your particular region. An ecoregion is, right now there's 867 ecoregions. These have only been mapped since the 1980s, but they are physical locations of species that are unique in that particular area. It's not a watershed phenomenon, it's about species, climate, soil type, in all interactions. And so particular zones of the website, you click on one particular ecoregion and you be delivered to a subsection of 130 categories in which you can post or view the interconnections. My last slide, wide network mobile development is best bang for the development buck. I would argue we are living through a mobile revolution in development. Why? You've seen some of the data. It's particularly useful for weaker dominated states or corrupt states. It's merging online self-developed communities, environmental justice movements, mobile network culture, and participatory rural appraisal techniques. It's kind of a grassroots command economy is being developed, and I think we're really interested in the Sustainable Development Goals if it was gamed into an app. As I said, the digital surplus, mobile phones, particularly in some countries, actually there are more females online than males on some services. In the United States, there are more Black Americans actually using mobile technology than white Americans. So historically, the ideas of digital divide are deductively assumed to apply to every new technology. I'm saying that's false for mobile technologies. Mobile technologies, because they're cheaper and more portable, they are used by lower socioeconomic status groups more often than richer groups. So it's a great way to reach the people that are historically neglected within development decisions if you choose a mobile phone technology. More bang for the developmental buck, as I said, because many corrupt or weak states, they don't have the capacity to, even if they did agree a few years ago to do the Sustainable Development Goals, to roll out their own roads, much less education and training about sustainable development issues, unless it's a mobile app that's already ready-made and accessible for them online. So that's the point. As a globally even saturated market, which is odd for technology, and that's really what's happening now, mobile phone networks are a greater crucial part in both developing and in less developed countries, not just a biased issue. And they're a shared platform for social and economic development. Charts of the world show a mobile phone is seen as the most important device the world round, except for where we are, except in North America and Europe, because they're already developed. And so I would argue there is in the developed world, a bias that keeps many in the developmental trade from realizing the deep importance of mobile networks of phones for various social services in developing countries. Thus, the poor states lack. Mobile networks are their first stable developmental infrastructure. I could have talked earlier, but even during the war in Afghanistan, international war going on for over a decade and a half, their mobile subscription rates are going up. And this is really hard to see any kind of other development that could even take place under those kind of situations. But mobile phones are very valuable systems and they're accessible for everyone. And you can piggyback so many different kinds of applications upon them. The world has already seen many apps that have changed the world, like Ushahidi, which comes out of, I believe, Kenya. It's a Swahili word for witness. M-Pesa, Kenyan word for mobile money. Citizen science, mobile education, you name it. So the last idea, in conclusion, the best bang for the SDG buck is to fund networkable mobile apps for development. Commodity ecology is a globally modular idea that fits across all watersheds and ecoregions of the world. Each of the 3 mobile apps would network people in various actual geographies for their own sustainable designs as they learn to be sustainable for themselves with other assistance, one watershed at a time. Thank you.